it's time for Professor Thomasson's second Pufendorf lecture. And the title of today's talk is Misdirections in Metaphysics 2, the Truthmaker Conception of Metaphysics. And as usual, the talk will be followed by a Q&A session. So the floor is yours. Please, Amie.
Okay, thank you again for having me here. And to those of you who were here yesterday also, thank you for coming back. To those of you who this is the first one, thanks for coming. So yesterday, as you'll remember, I presented the question that's sort of the organizing theme for these lectures. What should we do about or with metaphysics? And yesterday I focused on one prominent conception of metaphysics, certainly in the sort of post-Quinean era, and that's the idea that metaphysics should be explanatory in something like the same sense as the sciences are, that it's all part of a unified approach. I argued that this is an approach to metaphysics or an understanding of metaphysics that we should give up. That it relies on the assumption that all the nouns that we care about in metaphysics, whether they're terms for particles or tables or possible worlds or moral requirements or whatever, that they all should serve an explanatory function, right? And thereby rejects the idea that there are things referred to if positing those entities does not add explanatory power, or if they are not things that we have to quantify over in our best explanatory theories. And I suggested at the end that we should really start a step back, rather than starting with metaphysical questions, what exists, what's the nature of possibility, or something like that, to ask first questions about the language. Why do we have these terms? What functions do they serve? By what rules do they come to enter language? And how do they compare to some of the sort of simple congruent discourse that we're likely to model all language on, talk about trees and dogs and so on? Because starting a step back, I started to suggest there, can sometimes enable us to diagnose some old metaphysical problems as pseudo-problems, or find new ways around them and new ways to solve them. Today I'll focus on a different approach to metaphysics that I think has also played a big role in the last, say, 70 years in the revival of metaphysics in the kind of post-positivist era. And that's what you might broadly call the truthmaker approach. I'll try to show first how it leads us into certain kinds of difficulties, troubles with various uses to which it's put, and epistemological mysteries. I'll try again in this case to diagnose the mistake behind the truthmaker assumption as arising from an implicit functional monist assumption. So even though the explanatory approach and the truthmaker approach are really pretty different approaches to metaphysics, they both suffer from a similar kind of problem, a kind of implicit assumption of functional monism, or you might like to say working from a single kind of paradigm of language and assuming that everything falls under that model. In the case of the explanatory approach, right, that assumption was that all of our noun terms of interest in metaphysics work roughly like the terms posited by scientists, posits for Neptune or black holes or particles, right, namely to explain. The functional monist assumption that arises for the truthmaker theorist is a little bit different. It's not an assumption that all this discourse serves an explanatory function, but something like a descriptive function, that it all serves to represent or describe the world, and so requires us to say what features of the world make it true. I'll talk about the problems that arise from this assumption. This talk really has three parts today. So the first part will be talking about this truthmaker conception, and at least briefly some of the difficulties it faces. The difficulties it faces, as I suggested, I'll argue, arise from assuming a kind of functional monism when we need to accept a kind of functional pluralism. Part two will try to make good on this functional pluralist talk by giving us a view about how we can get a framework within which we can come to understand linguistic functions. A systematic way of approaching them, sort of top-down, again, using the work of systemic functional linguistics. And I think once we get this approach to linguistic functions on hand, it'll also make clear why the truth-maker approach is so tempting and sounds so good, right? And yet why it's also, at the end of the day, inadequate, again, as an across-the-board approach to problems in metaphysics. I'll also try to show how this approach to understanding linguistic functions can help in taking this step back that I advocated yesterday. And finally, I'll try to give you a demonstration. Part 3 will be at least a brief suggestion of how appreciating the kind of functional pluralism and giving up the truth-maker approach can enable us to resolve some old metaphysical problems. And I'll just work through briefly one example for you that I've worked on elsewhere, the problems of modality. Right? So the part 3 will be modality. So it'll be truth-maker approach and its problems, a way to identify linguistic functions, then an application to modality. All right, let's go. So the truth-maker conception, right, roughly assumes that all language aims to represent or describe the world in a way that entitles us to ask what explains what makes any claim true. It's a approach that's familiar from Wittgenstein's Tractatus, probably popularized particularly by David Armstrong in the latter half of the 20th century. Also defended by philosophers like John Heil, Heather Dyke, Ross Cameron. They each have kind of their own particular way of doing it too, so we have to be a little careful. We can't always throw them all in the same bucket, though they are all truth-maker theorists. I'll draw some distinctions among them. In some mouths, the task will be to say what makes any claim true. In some mouths, like Cameron's, it'll involve a conception of metaphysics as aiming to tell us what's fundamental, right? Or what describes the fundamental world. Okay, so Armstrong, right, with, I believe, his Pufendorf medal, yes. Just happened to pull that one down. Says, to postulate certain truth makers for certain truths is to admit those truth makers to one's ontology. The complete range of truth makers admitted constitutes a metaphysics. Now, Armstrong explicitly develops, of course, this truth-maker approach as an alternative to Quine's criterion of ontological commitment. Right? So, on Quine's view, as everybody knows, right, we're ontologically committed to whatever we must quantify over in order to render the statements of our best theory, best total theory, properly regimented in logical form, true. Armstrong says, no, wait, that stacks the deck against the predicate side, right? So if you have a simple sentence like, some dogs are white, right? Then on the Quinean criterion, that's only going to commit you to dogs. And Armstrong says, hang on, what about the is white side? There must be something demanded of the world for the predicate to properly apply. We've got to look for the truth makers for the whole proposition. Right? And so our ontological commitments on this view are determined not by what we must quantify over to render true the statements of our best theories, but rather by whatever is required of the world for the truth of our statements, including both subject and predicate side. Then the goal of metaphysics can be understood in these terms for Armstrong. Right? If you think of metaphysics as telling you what there is anyway, that side of metaphysics, maybe you want to say that's ontology, but Armstrong counted it as metaphysics, then the complete range of truth makers that you admit constitutes your metaphysics. And so Armstrong claims looking for truth makers is an illuminating and useful regimentation of the metaphysical enterprise. Now, in different hands, this gets developed differently, as I was saying. Ross Cameron, somewhat more recently, adopts a kind of truth-maker theory with a slightly different goal. What he wants is to use the truth-maker approach to determine not what exists, but what exists fundamentally. So he tries to distinguish what are the fundamental truth-makers for a claim like Beethoven wrote a symphony, or there is a table here, or whatever. And it's those fundamentality commitments that Cameron is interested in as revealing the fundamental ontology of the world. In some ways, on the surface, Cameron will agree with me that, of course, things like tables and symphonies, there are such things, right? But they're not fundamental, he wants to say, and that's what's truly important. So the fundamentality commitments of a sentence, on Cameron's view, are those entities that must number amongst the ontology of the world if the world is to provide an adequate grounding of the truth of the sentence. And then this is supposed to enable us to get a sparse fundamental ontology, which is Cameron's goal. There's a third kind of application of truthmaker theory that's a little bit less ambitious than either let's find the truthmakers or let's find the fundamental truthmakers, and thus what exists fundamentally. And that's the idea that an appeal to truthmakers can at least provide a useful constraint in ontological projects. I mean, Armstrong actually introduces this way in his criticisms of Gilbert Ryle's work on dispositions and on the mind, which we'll come back to in a minute. This has been, again, defended by recent authors, including Ted Sider, right, who says, look, the truthmaker principle provides a way of catching cheaters. We ask them to state they're truthmakers for the truths they accept. If they can't do it, we can accuse them of cheating and throw them out of the metaphysics room or ignore what they have to say, right? So it's this is a view that says not we're going to use the appeal to truthmakers to tell us what the true fundamental ontology is, but at least it's a constraint that metaphysicians must obey. And again, this comes out of Armstrong too. Okay, so, well, sorry, we'll come back to that in a sec. Some of you might remember this idea was introduced by Armstrong in criticizing Ryle's work in Philosophy of Mind, saying that Ryle's appeal to, this is kind of misreading, we'll come back to this, dispositions in understanding mental states, right? To say that our mental state claims are claims about beliefs and desires are dispositional claims, that he doesn't provide truth makers for what makes the dispositional claims true, right? He leaves dispositions hanging on air, is what Armstrong says about Ryle. Right? We'll come back to that in a minute. And this, of course, is then what prompted Armstrong instead to adopt central state materialism, trying to find brain states to fill that role. All right, so what are the troubles with truth makers? Well, it depends on what you want to use them for, really. And again, I'm not entirely against it. I was kind of brought up in part on this approach. Armstrong was one of my teachers. But I think in terms of these uses to which truth maker theory is put, it can really lead us astray. So suppose you want to try to form your fundamental ontology or just your metaphysics in Armstrong's words by figuring out what the truth makers are for the claims you accept, right? Figure out the truth makers, you figure out your metaphysics. Well, how do we figure out what the truth makers are for the claims that we accept? Like, what's the epistemology here, right? Armstrong, characteristically, is really admirably intellectually honest here. And at several places, he'll say, yeah, it's really hard. The hunt for truth makers is as controversial and difficult as the enterprise of metaphysics. And there's no easy and automatic road to determine the truth makers. So if you have to ask about a methodology, how do you figure out what they are? You don't get much more answer that I've found than this acknowledgement. It's really hard. It's as hard as metaphysics. Metaphysics is hard, right? Which is more or less literally what Ross Cameron says. Here's a way of illustrating the problem. Suppose you accept a really simple truth. This ought to be an easy one, right? Like, this ball is red, right? Well, what are the real truth makers for this claim? You've got all sorts of options, right? Metaphysicians have been very inventive in considering options. It could be a matter of the ball instantiating the universal redness. Or is it a matter of the ball possessing a redness trope? Or of there being this state of affairs, the balls being red? Or of the particles that are arranged ball-wise jointly instantiating the universal redness? Or maybe you want to go to a feature placing language and say, really, it's just that it's balling redly around here, right? That's the real truth maker for the claim the ball is red. You've got a huge range of options, right? Metaphysicians have been very inventive. If you think that our appeal to truth makers is going to give us a metaphysics, which one of these is it? Which are the real truth makers? How do we tell? Part of the underlying problem here, why we get so many options and no apparent direct way to decide among them. I mean, some people, of course, appeal to the theoretic virtues to decide among them. I talked about that yesterday and why that leads into other difficulties because it's not clear that they're truth conducive, especially in metaphysics. But part of the underlying difficulty here, you might say, comes from what you might call the ontological flexibility of language, something that metaphysicians have kind of inadvertently discovered and made clearer than it ever was before, with all their sort of inventive paraphrases to avoid ontological commitments as they saw them, especially in Quinean style. That is to say, there's typically a range of grammatically alternative ways of stating what the truth makers could be for any sentence, where these grammatically alternative statements, according to the truth maker theorist, right, aren't just grammatical variants, but will give us different ontological or fundamentality commitments, whether you're committed to tropes or universals, states of affairs, or just features, objects, right, whatever. Now, this ought to sound familiar from yesterday, this idea that there are grammatically alternative ways of stating any of these facts or any of these claims about the truth makers. So the problem is, how could we tell among these which are the real truth makers? And truth maker theorists who want to use the appeal to truth makers as a way to give us a metaphysics or a view of what's fundamental are committed to the idea that some of these are right, most one of these is right anyway, and the rest are wrong. There's no empirical differences among them, as everybody will agree, as to whether you accept, say, tropes or universals or just states of affairs or whatever. And we saw yesterday the problems with the theoretic virtues, both in leading to stalemates in most actual debates, including lots of the ones that Armstrong entered into, and doubts about whether the theoretic virtues are truth conducive, especially in metaphysics. Okay, so that's, I think, a significant epistemological problem for using the appeal to truth makers as a way to give you an ontology or a fundamental ontology, a view of what's fundamental, right? How can we know which is the right one of these? So suppose you want to just retreat at this stage and say, okay, maybe I never really wanted that. Truth makers, the appeal to truth makers at least provides a useful constraint in metaphysics, a way of catching the cheaters, right? And again, this is a prominent theme. So both Heil and Armstrong cite their acquisition of the idea of truth makers to Charlie Martin. So here's Charlie Martin at the top, who says, when a statement concerning the world is true, there must be something about the world that makes it true. Whatever statement, if it's true, there's got to be a truth maker. Armstrong says, the truth maker insight prevents the metaphysician from letting dispositions hang on air, as they do in Ryle's philosophy of mind. That is the ultimate sin in metaphysics, or at any rate, in a realist metaphysics. And Ted Sider says, the point of the truth maker principle is to rule out dubious ontologies that posit ungrounded truths, and to catch cheaters who are unwilling to accept an ontology robust enough to bear the weight of the truths they feel free to invoke. This is also sometimes enshrined in principle of truth maker maximalism, right? Every truth must have a truth maker, very widely accepted. So there's the truth maker principle. Oh, here's some more instances of it. Every true proposition must be made true by something. All true indicative sentences must have truth makers, and truth maker maximalism. Every truth has a truth maker. Here's what Armstrong says immediately on introducing it. He's like, I don't really have an argument for this, but my hope is that philosophers of realist inclinations will be immediately attracted to the idea that a truth, any truth, should depend for its truth on something outside it, in virtue of which it is true. And I think his hope has been borne out. Many, many people, as we saw in the earlier quotes, have been immediately attracted to this idea. The question is, though, whether this is an idea that we should accept across the board, or if it can lead us astray, at least for some kinds of discourse. So if we go back to where Armstrong introduces the idea of truth makers, right? As I mentioned, Armstrong introduces it as a criticism of Ryle's work on the mind and on dispositions. And he accuses Ryle then of cheating, roughly, by letting dispositions hang on air, not giving the truth makers for dispositional claims. But it seems to me, unfortunately, that Armstrong has just fundamentally missed Ryle's point here in ways that have mattered for decades to follow in philosophy, and probably in part have led to Ryle being dismissed. Right? Ryle's whole point in the concept of mind, of course, is that mental talk about beliefs and desires, for example, and dispositional talk, which he thinks this is related to, is fulfilling a different function, right? It's not even trying to describe some properties in the world. Our mental talk is neither trying to describe special Cartesian mental things nor physical things. It's doing something else. Similarly for our dispositional talk, straightforward dispositional talk, like talk about the glass being fragile. We're not trying to describe, Ryle will say, some sort of hidden little dispositional property that it has, the property of being fragile, in addition to all of its categorical properties, like having a certain structure of its molecules and so on, and chemical structure, right? Instead, we're doing something else. We're licensing inferences, right? So if I say that the glass is fragile, what I'm doing now is not describing the glass, but licensing you to infer or expect that it will break if I drop it, say, on a tile floor from a height. Yeah. So Ryle's whole point is this isn't the kind of discourse that is world describing, and thus that would require what Armstrong calls truth makers. So we can see right here a kind of covering over and forgetting of the kind of functional pluralist point that Ryle was bringing out, and that was sort of more commonly discussed in Ryle's day, and that has since kind of fallen out of a large portion of the philosophical consciousness, at least among metaphysicians. So insisting on truth makers for any true indicative that you accept as a way to catch cheaters just builds in a kind of way of ruling out the possibility of functional pluralism, of the idea that not all of our sentences, and not even all of our indicative sentences, have the function of describing the world and tracking its features so that it makes sense to ask, what is it in the world that makes them true? Another way to put this is it sort of rules out without argument a range of views in philosophy that probably deserve to not just be ruled out without argument, at least engaged with, instead of just accused of cheating. Ryle's view of dispositional and mental statements and statements of law. Ramsey's view that universal generalizations are not judgments about the world, but rules for judging. If I see an A, I shall count it as a B, right? Blackburn's and Gibbard's views of moral discourse as expressing attitudes or planning states rather than as trying to describe moral features of the world. Seller's view of counterfactuals, Brandam's view of statements of necessity and possibility, and also that view of necessity that I develop in Norms and Necessity. Brandam takes them, of course, to be ways of making explicit the rules of use for other terms, right? Not to be descriptions of modal properties. Moreover, not only does accepting the truth maker principle as a constraint on absolutely any true indicative we accept, rule out a bunch of classic philosophical views without argument, it also sort of corners us into a range of very unappealing options for dealing with some of these difficult areas of discourse, like modal discourse, moral discourse, mathematical discourse, right? Suppose you do try to figure out what the truth makers are for our moral and modal statements. And actually, if you look in a lot of like standard encyclopedia philosophy type articles on modality, the first thing they start with is something like, the problem of modality is the problem of finding truth makers for our modal claims. Right? Just this assumption this is the right way to think of the problem. But if you do posit some truth makers, suppose for the modal statements you posit possible worlds or modal properties of this world, right? Suppose for moral statements you posit moral properties, right? Then you immediately hit all the familiar problems. How can we place these things in the natural world? How are our modal properties, for example, related to the natural properties of objects, right? So why is it that, say, this comes up as the grounding problem in modal metaphysics, of course, right? Which is, you got the statue and the clay. They've got all the same intrinsic properties. So how could they have different modal properties, one of them being capable of surviving a change in shape and the other not, right? How could that go? If you want to posit moral properties, how could these mere things in the world possibly be action guiding, as moral properties are supposed to be, right? You get what Shamik Dasgupta calls the problem of missing value. In both cases, how could they be known, right? If you go along with Hume's early observation that we can't observe modal properties, we can't observe necessity in the world, right? Then how could we possibly come to know what's necessary and what's possible? Similarly, for the moral, if we don't think of these as sort of perceptible properties in the world that we could be in causal contact with, how could we possibly come to know about them? And we get the problems of moral and modal epistemology. That all happens if you do posit truth makers on a whole range of diverging views. Well, your alternative, if you take this presupposition, is you don't posit truth makers. And then it looks like if you accept the truth maker principle, you're stuck with, again, some unappealing options. Eliminativism, right? There are no truth makers, so perhaps all of our moral claims are strictly speaking false, or our modal claims. Or maybe you can be a fictionalist and just treat them as sort of true within some story, but not really, really true, right? Both of those views have significant costs as well. So accepting truth maker maximalism rules out a range of appealing theories without argument and corners us into a ton of unappealing options and problems, both metaphysical and epistemological. So we might then at this stage come to Ramsey's maxim, which I had as the little front quote at the start of the slides. Ramsey says, "It's a heuristic maxim that the truth lies not in one of two disputed views, perhaps realism or eliminativism about moral or modal properties, but in some third possibility which has not yet been thought of, which we can only discover by rejecting something as assumed as obvious by both the disputants." In this case, that would be the functional monist assumption that all true statements require truth makers. Right. So my suggestion is that we suspend both the truth maker approach and the explanatory approach to metaphysics. That we can see that both of these implicitly rely on a functional monist assumption. This is not something that's articulated by the defenders of these views. It's something that has to be in place for the criteria and demands they impose to make sense. The contribution of explanatory power criterion only makes sense if the function of the term is to explain, to fuel a theory's explanations. The truthmaker maximalist view only makes sense if all of our indicative discourse serves to describe the world, right? Now, when children, at least in the US, I don't know how it is here, when children act as if language is only there to describe facts and to state facts, they get sent to speech therapy for pragmatics lessons. Actually true, this actually happened to my daughter, right? But this has gone somewhat unchecked, I'd say, among metaphysicians. I mean, similarly, you've seen something like this observation raised in recent Speech Act theory, right? That those who defend free speech on grounds that it's going to contribute to the discovery of truth in a democracy rely on the idea that all speech is there to try to state truths rather than to insult, exclude, denigrate, etc., right? So what I'm asking is in metaphysics, we also notice this assumption and step back from it. Start a step back instead before we make any kind of functional monist assumption, asking what functions the discourse serves and how it works, what rules it follows. And this, I think, then can lead us to reassess the legitimacy and relevance of some of the criteria, like contribute explanatory power, some of the demands, like give me the truth makers, commonly imposed in metaphysics. Okay, but then, even if you're on board with me this far, you might still have lots of questions. All right, so we're going to accept the possibility of functional pluralism. But what do we mean by function here? How can we determine the functions of parts of our discourse? And make good on this claim. If we do that, how can identifying different functions enable us to make new progress on old metaphysical problems? That's on the epistemological ones too. All right, so for this, and the idea that language serves many functions is familiar from the history of philosophy, even if it's been forgotten by many recent metaphysicians. Right? It's familiar in the work of people like J.L. Austin, Wittgenstein, perhaps most famously, Ryle, I've been mentioning. In other cases, it's not argued for as a general principle, but functionally alternative readings of certain areas of discourse are offered, as Hare's work arguing that moral discourse is one kind of prescriptive discourse, Blackburn's work on moral discourse as expressing attitudes, Brandam's work on modality, Gibbard's work on morality, Perez-Caballo I mentioned yesterday on mathematical discourse, Dorit Bar-On does a kind of expressivist view of mental discourse, and so on. Right? So it's familiar out there. But I think it's true that there hasn't been a very systematic way of trying to identify or say how we can identify linguistic functions. And this has been one thorn in the side of trying to develop these functionally alternative approaches that leads to a certain kind of skepticism, even among those who are broadly sympathetic to the approach. Right? So here's Austin, right? Ought to be a friend of the approach, who says, "We have not got to go very far back in the history of philosophy to find philosophers assuming more or less as a matter of course that the sole interesting business of any utterance is to be true or at least false. Of course, they had always known that there are other kinds of things which we say, things like imperatives, the expression of wishes and exclamations, but still philosophers have assumed that the only things that they're interested in are utterances which report facts or which describe situations truly or falsely." Okay, actually, sorry, that's a prior quote of Austin's illustrating the functional pluralism. We'll get him worrying about not having a systematic approach to functions in a second. There we are. Okay, that's more Austin. Okay, so the doubts that are raised are often these: can we really say anything helpful, unified, or systematic about linguistic function? And there's often, you know, as I've experienced in giving talks on some of this stuff, a kind of suspicion out there that you're just making stuff up about function to serve your philosophical purposes. Where do you get this stuff from anyway, right? Even Wittgenstein, probably the best known defender of something like a functional pluralism, refused to say anything systematic about linguistic function, or pretty much anything, I think. He just enjoined us to look and notice the variety of language games that are played, right? And so this, again, led to some doubts and backlash, right? And this is the Austin quote I mentioned a minute ago. He says, pretty clearly, I think, having Wittgenstein in mind, certainly there are a great many uses of language. It's rather a pity that people are apt to invoke a new use of language whenever they feel so inclined, to help them out of this, that, or the other well-known philosophical tangle. We need more of a framework in which to discuss these uses of language. And also, I think, we should not despair too easily and talk, as people are apt to do, about the infinite uses of language, right? So he doesn't want this just looking all over the place and we can't say anything systematic. I'll try to give something of a framework. Ayer, similarly, right? Again, sort of no foe. He's sort of, right, a motivist, right, a sort of predecessor of the whole non-descriptive kind of ethical theory. But in his little history book he wrote, talking about Wittgenstein, he says, when one goes through this list of ways language is used, one sees that what counts as a particular use of language or a separate language game is fairly arbitrary. So there's, again, this sort of call that says, we need something more systematic to stay here. Notice first here that the reference is to a particular use of language, right? And some of you might be wondering why we can't just turn to speech act theory to solve this kind of functional problem. Right? Here's a really short answer. I love speech act theory, but it didn't quite solve my problem, right? Because you can use a term in many different ways, in many different contexts, right? Just like you can use other artifacts, like a coin. You can use to buy stuff, or you can use it to make tap shoes, right? Or you can use it as a screwdriver, and so on, right? So we have many different uses, but there still may be a unifying function or sets of functions that remain in place and remain constant across a range of different ways that it's used. So appealing to something like a unified linguistic function that endures even across different uses is going to enable us, I think, to solve some problems that we can't reach just by talking about uses of language. Here's another expression of doubts from somebody less sympathetic than Ayer or Austin, right? It's been raised really recently. Doubts about the idea that we can give any useful account of linguistic functions, useful and systematic. This is Herman Kaplan, right, in his work on conceptual engineering, responding to people like me and Sally Haslinger, who appeal to linguistic functions in our work in conceptual engineering. He says this: you want to talk about function? The reason salmon is useful for us is that it can be used to talk about salmons. The reason freedom is useful is that it can be used to talk about freedom. However, and this is the key point, beyond these disquotationally specified functions, there's variability. We can use freedom in speech acts that have as their aim to undermine freedom, or promote it, or discuss it, or disparage, or make fun of it, or there's no limit to what we can go on to do with this term. These activities will vary wildly between contexts and over time. If the goal is to find functions that are more substantive and informative than the disquotationally specified functions, then it will be unsuccessful, he just predicts. Notice again his emphasis here on the ways it's used, right? And the variety of uses to which pennies are put, I think, does not undermine the idea that there's some more unified function. So let's see. So I set about to try to figure out if there's something more unified that can be said about linguistic functions and how we can say it. And that's really what sent me to the work in systemic functional linguistics that I introduced you to yesterday. All right, this is why I don't focus on speech act theory. We did that already. Okay, so one problem, right, that's alluded to in Kaplan there is that there's so many varied uses to which any term is put that we can't say anything systematic. Well, I think Hugh Price gives us a nice clue about how to approach the problem nonetheless. So Price talks about a multifunctional normal old artifact, like string, right? Used for all sorts of things. Is there anything useful we can still say about the function of string? Well, Price's suggestion is if you've got a multifunctional tool like string, look for the core properties of string that are exploited in and enable many or most of its uses. Things like being thin, long, flexible, strong, right? These are always important, whether you're using string to weave a hammock or to tie up a boat or whatever, right? So let's see if we can do something similar for language. And I think we can with the help of systemic functional linguistics. As I mentioned yesterday, the reason I like this approach is it sort of directly addresses these questions about what functions are served by the various elements of the linguistic system. Things like the ability to nominalize, a mood system, a modal system, and so on. Where function is understood as a kind of system function in roughly Rob Cummins' sense, for those of you who know that work, that is a way of asking what the capacities contribute to the capacities of the system. So the systemic functional linguistics work investigates ways that the functions of language get reflected in the internal organization of language as a system, on the assumption that the nature of language is closely related to the functions it has to serve in human life. So what they're really going to give us, and I'll try to draw this out for you, is something like core properties of language that enable it to serve a huge variety of functions in human life. Let's see how that goes. So one way of getting into this work is developmentally, and they spent a long time on developmental linguistics. So if you go back, I mentioned yesterday, like the kind of proto-language of the toddler who's just learning language initially, go back there. Even there, or maybe I think Halliday would say especially there, you can see the functional pluralism of language. One of the reasons he's worried about functional monism, assuming that all language is representational, is because he thinks this doesn't enable the adults who are supposed to help the kids with language delays understand what the kid's problem is and teach it well. He's got really practical concerns in mind. Because for a toddler who's just learning language, language is overtly multifunctional and it wears its different functions on its sleeve, right? So as he says, the functional origin of language is most evident in the language of young children. Here's what's distinctive about toddler language, right? They're functionally simple. Characteristically, each utterance serves just one function. We'll get the contrast case in a minute. So think about how they identifies 7, the 7th is on the next slide, functions commonly served by this early proto-language, right? And there are a huge range of them. So think about what a child can do when they learn language that they can't do so well otherwise, right? Again, speech therapists work on this kind of problem, right? And what they'll say is the problem for the toddler who has a language delay isn't that they can't state truths about the world and inform their parents or their friends about them, is that they can't make their needs known. And then they get frustrated. And then they behave in ways that become difficult for their caregivers, right? And so on. Because here's some things you can do if you've got language. And if you're a toddler who hasn't got language, you can't do them nearly so well or efficiently if you can do them at all. Here's 6 functions. One's an instrumental function. Language used to satisfy material needs. The kid cries for milk to get milk. Then there's also this regulatory function, language used to control the behavior of others. Right? If the kid yells, "Mama, come," they're trying to control the mother's behavior now. Then there's this interactional function. In some kids, this comes first, where you learn to use language socially, to greet, to part, to wave bye-bye, to say hi, right, and so on. Then there's personal uses of language to express the child's feelings of interest, pleasure, disgust, and so forth. The child may say yuck to the food that's given them as a mark of refusal or expression of disgust, or yay when something good happens, or do that constant, like, drop things off the high chair and say oops each time, right? There's also the heuristic use of language, when the child uses language to investigate their environment, right? Most kids go through this phase where they'll constantly point at objects and hope their caregivers will name them, right? So that they can then use the term dog to go ask more about the doggies and collect their information about dogs together. And then there's also, very early on, according, again, to their data, it's this kind of imaginative function, language used in play and pretense. So notice how diverse these functions are. Generally, we have short utterances, each one serving one function. Rather later, again, they've got all the sort of documentation on this from their empirical studies, comes the informative or representational function, right? Language as used to communicate information about the world to someone you think doesn't know it, right? And again, those of you who have raised or spent a lot of time around young kids may have noticed this experience. I mean, my kids were talking and bossing me around, using the regulative and, what was the instrumental functions of language, long before they could come back from preschool and tell me what happened today, right? That was at age 4, and they were bossing me around from like age 1, right? So it's a long time before they can get to this purely representational use, or you'd say something like, "I got a lollipop at school today." Okay, now it doesn't matter too much if these are the right 7 functions of proto-language, or if this is the right categorization, or if some should be recategorized with others. What's important here is 2 things. One is to notice the functional pluralism even in this very primitive form of language, where it's kind of really obvious, right? The other is to notice that what's going on in this language is characteristically one utterance, one function, because that's going to change with the mature language. So what happens when we become mature language speakers? Oh, sorry, but I'll get to that in a second. We have first preliminary diagnoses. I think looking at these, we can start to get a kind of diagnosis of the 2 different approaches we've looked at, where the explanatory approach to metaphysics assumes something like a heuristic explanatory function across the board, and the truth-maker approach assumes something like an informational or representational approach across the board. Again, leaving a lot out. All right, mature language now. So what's interesting about mature language is that linguistic form or grammar, that's the core property, like the thinness, strength, and flexibility of string, right? Enables speakers of a mature language to serve more than one function at a time. Characteristically, most utterances of a mature speaker will serve 3 different kinds of what they call macro functions, sort of groupings of functions at the same time. So every adult linguistic act, with a few broadly specifiable exceptions, is serving more than one function at once. Linguistic form, or having a grammar, including allowing these kinds of grammatical transformations we talked about yesterday, allows for meanings which derive from different functions that would be coming from different roots in the child's proto-language to be encoded together as integrated structures so that every expression becomes in principle functionally complex. Grammar makes it possible to mean more than one thing at a time. The 3 kinds of functions, these 3 macro functions that they identify are these. The first is an ideational macro function. This is mostly what philosophers focus on, right? This is roughly encoding a propositional content, right? But then there's also a whole range of interpersonal functions. So there's this interpersonal macro function. Again, I'm not wild about the term interpersonal, but roughly these kinds of functions establish social relations and enable speakers to express themselves and so on. So they'll show a speaker's relation to the listener or reader, enable speakers to show their attitudes, judgments, level of certainty, and so on. In English, these interpersonal functions are carried by mood. So you show your relationship to your interlocutor, by whether you, say, command them or politely inform them of something or ask them a question. You take up different relationships to your interlocutor, right? And by modality. So I might show my hesitancy, right? If I think it's going to rain tonight, rather than saying it's going to rain tonight, to say it might rain tonight. And then I'm showing my hesitancy, expressing that while still talking about the world and encoding a content. Then there's also these textual macro functions, which organize a sort of longer piece of text as a piece of writing or speech, making evident the theme and the relations among ideas and what follows from what. It's these textual macro functions we talked about yesterday with the grammatical metaphors coming to serve textual macro functions. So just to give you an exemplification of how these work together in a characteristic speech act, right? Suppose you are at the home of an acquaintance and they offer you some tea, and suppose you're English and you really want some milk to go in that tea. All right. Now, if you're a little kid, well, if you're English, you're probably still drinking tea, right? You've got one option if you got the proto-language. If you have no language, you got to just grab it, right? If you've got simple language, you can just utter milk in a demanding tone and hope for the best. If you're a mature speaker, you probably won't do that, right? You've got instead a range of options, a range of different mood options. For example, you can put it in a command and you can say, give me milk. You probably won't do that either, right? In most social settings, at the home of an acquaintance, you want to be polite to. You're probably not just going to want to take up the relationship of commander barking orders at your host, right? So you could just put it in an indicative. Instead, I'm just talking about myself. I want milk, right? Even that might seem too direct to be polite. You could put it in an interrogative and say, do you have some milk? And count on your hearer to understand the ideational content that you want milk. You could be even more polite and put it in a modal interrogative. Might I have some milk? Right? And so on. So each of these will sort of serve the same immediate purpose of trying to get milk, express roughly the same ideational content, I want milk, right? And yet they have these variations in terms of mood and modality that also enable you to establish different kinds of relationship to your speaker, to your interlocutor. Now, if you stick this in a conversational interaction, we can see the textual functions too, right? So they might bring you your tea. Before you look into it, you might say, oh, is it a black tea, right? If they say yes, then you can say, then I would like some milk for it, right? And you can see in this utterance now the performance of these three macro functions, right? So the then and the interjection into the conversation of that shows the textual relation, that it's because of the blackness of the tea that you would like some milk for it, in a way that enables and entitles your listener to infer that in the future, whenever you get black tea, you'll want milk in it, right? You've also got the interpersonal functions of politeness and so on, served by the introduction of the modal and by the use of the indicative form rather than a command. And you got the ideational content, give me milk. Right. All right, so that's a view of how in adult conversation, characteristically, each utterance serves more than one function at a time. And you've got all these options for how to serve these different functions at once, given the grammar. Okay, now we can get a little bit more insight to why we should expect the kind of ontological flexibility of language that I argued at the beginning today creates a problem for truthmaker theorists, at least if they see the truthmaker approach is going to give us the unique statement of what are the truthmakers, right? This ontological flexibility of language reflects this kind of grammatical variability that's absolutely characteristic of adult language, that we can make these kinds of grammatical transformations because they enable us to perform textual and interpersonal functions on top of the ideational functions. But if that's the case, then we just get all this capacity for grammatical variation, then the question, which are the real truth makers, is really a misguided question. You've got options, you've got grammatical options. It's not like one describes the truths of the world in a way the other doesn't. Better question, instead of which are the real truth makers, is why should we have these grammatically diverse ways of speaking? Okay, so now we can also diagnose a bit better the kind of functional monist mistake that we saw played out in the truthmaker theorist. The representational function is one of many functions of language, and it's acquired relatively late. Here's something I found interesting. Again, these linguists don't have a philosophical axe to grind, right? They're worried more about language development and teaching. But they notice that even in non-philosophers, normal old adults, right, there's a tendency to think of language only in representational or ideational terms. However, as Halliday puts it, language is, in addition to all its other guises, a means of communicating about something, of expressing propositions. That's the ideational function. The child's aware that he can convey a message in language, but this is the only model of language that many adults have, and a very inadequate model it is from the point of view of the child. And it's the same assumption that's quite typical that underlies the truth-maker approach to metaphysics. Now, we can also see a kind of grain of truth behind it, why it's tempting, right? Because adult language does, certainly if it's in the indicative form, carry this ideational content, right? Even if it's modal language or moral language or mathematical language or whatever, right? The mistake lies not in suggesting that adult indicatives carry ideational content, but rather in thinking of them on the model of sort of congruent representational statements, right, that would aim to describe elements of the environment that we can introduce terms for observationally and track. So the functional modest assumption leads us astray because language that originates from other macro functions via other rules, not from a representational sort of proto-function, can also be expressed in propositional form. It has ideational content. And you can say, if you like, in a kind of, deflated, harmless sense that the terms refer to properties, moral facts, whatever. But these superficial similarities that two claims say, the dog is white and murder is wrong, right? Or it's possible that it will rain tonight, can mislead us into interpreting them all in a kind of robust truth-maker way that makes us think it's right to ask, what are the real truth-makers for our moral and modal claims? And they can paper over crucial differences in the way these bits of language come to enter our talk about possible worlds or moral requirements versus our talk about dogs, and paper over the differences in the range of functions served by talk of dogs and trees versus talk of moral requirements and possibilities. And it's failing to notice these and working from a single model that leads to puzzles and paradoxes. Hare already noticed this danger. Okay, so how can we identify linguistic functions, right? So what I think has a lot of promise, at least, this is really still new work, is the idea that we can begin from systemic functional linguistics for insights into the macro functions that are served by different elements of the linguistic system, many of which turn out to be philosophically relevant, right? So we can distinguish the ideational, regulative, and other interpersonal and textual functions, and notice that a lot of our problem terms in philosophy were things that, like property and noun terms, primarily introduced to serve textual functions. Modal and moral terms, primarily introduced to serve interpersonal functions. From there, we can nominalize, right, to serve textual functions, and we can state propositional content and have ideational content, but they still got into our language by a really different route than our congruent terms did. Now, there's also this really interesting recent work of Mathieu Kellot on pragmatic genealogy, who's taking a slightly different approach to asking questions about linguistic function. I've been trying to think about the relation between them. And I think it can go something like this for those Husserl fans out there. Right, we can sort of distinguish, I think, what we can get out of the work in systemic functional linguistics as identifying something like the formal functions, excuse me, of bits of our language according to their grammatical role and derivation. Sorry. I argued yesterday that terms like knowledge and justice and property of redness, right, are all grammatical metaphors that serve textual functions. But now you might ask a more specific question. Say, okay, cool. But what functions does the concept of knowledge have and serve that the concept of justice doesn't, and vice versa? What distinguishes those? What would we be lacking if we had some grammatical metaphors but none for knowledge or justice? And I think that's the kind of question that Kellot focuses on and identifies a bunch of work in the history of philosophy that has been taking this kind of approach. So this could be something like the material functions, right, to use the sort of Husserlian distinction. So I think that's how they fit together. I'll have most to contribute up here, but point you to Calo for a nice supplement. We might ask what different regulative functions are served by different modal terms, by epistemic modals versus metaphysical modals versus deontic modals. And by combining these two forms of functional analysis, I think, we can do much more fine-grained work. So a lot of the work that's been done previously, even the sort of functional alternative work, like Blackburn or something like that, right, will ask broad questions like, what functions do moral terms serve, right? A pretty good question. Are they descriptive of properties? Are they expressive? Are they regulative? But once we get the formal distinctions on board too, the kind of systemic functional linguistics stuff, then we can ask a much more fine-grained set of questions. And we can ask not just what functions do moral terms serve, but what's the difference between the functions of moral imperatives, like don't kill, and introducing explicitly deontic modal terms, like you oughtn't to kill, or you must not kill. Well, one thing, and this comes back to some of Ryle's work, right, is that only by introducing a modal term like may, right, can you give permissions. You can't give a permission with a command, right? You can give a requirement with a command. You could also put them on a scale. You can say things like, you ought to clean your room, but you must do your homework, right, as a way of making some more stringent than others. Again, if you just utter commands, you can't do that. You can't distinguish them in this way. What differences do these terms make versus introducing a moral predicate, like is right or is good? Well, that then enables us to generalize in certain ways. People who do things that are wrong should go to jail, right? Again, it's hard to get that kind of generalization just from a command. What else do we get by nominalizing to speak of moral requirements or permissions? Oh, well, here's some things we can get that are additional, right? Now we can quantify and qualify moral requirements, again, in a way you couldn't with commands or mere modal expressions. So you can say things like, I'll not go moral now, I'll just go every day, right? The requirements for the course I took with you this term are far more onerous than the requirements that for the course I took with you last term, right? We can compare for them. Or we can say there are 5 requirements that must be fulfilled to pass this course, right? And so on. So we can quantify and qualify them in helpful ways. That's at least a start, at least some differences, right, that we add through these different grammatical statements, even if they're all kind of regulative. All right, so finally, let me try to give you a little sketch of how this work on function can help dissolve some traditional puzzles, like with metaphysical modal discourse, which I worked on in Norms and Necessity. So as I mentioned before, this is usually just presented as the problem of modality is the problem of finding truth makers for our modal statements, asking if there's truth makers are other possible worlds or modal features of this world or potentialities or what. How are they related to the natural properties in the actual world? How can we come to know them? Classic problems of modality. Right. Again, we get these two distinctions, right? So modal claims are complicated because they come in a wide variety of forms, right? There's commonly distinguished these so-called different flavors of modality. So there's epistemic modals, there's deontic modals, logical modals, metaphysical modals, claims of physical necessity, right, or nomological necessity. I've worked pretty much on the metaphysical. And then we also get, like we did with the moral discourse, a range of different grammatical forms in which we can express these modal claims. We can use modal verbs, modal operators. We can talk in a nominalized way of possibilities, necessities, modal facts and properties, or possible worlds. But all of them originate in the modal system. And as we've seen, the modal system serves interpersonal functions. Functions like expressing attitudes, levels of certainty, taking up positions with respect to others, and, crucially, I think regulating behavior. That's where I'll focus in. So you can see, again, the way in which we can sort of progress through different additional functions, right, with our modal talk. So you can just say to your kid, clean your room in the imperative, right? That serves a regulative function already from the mood system. But then you can introduce a modal verb and say, you must clean your room, or you may go out to play. And now you can still fulfill that same regulatory function without commanding, kind of hiding your role as commander. This is just a fact of the world. You must clean your room. That's the way it is. You can introduce degrees between must and should and ought, and you can issue permissions. You can also introduce modal nominalizations and say there is a requirement that all boarding students clean their rooms at 10 p.m. if you're running a boarding school, for example, right? Now making it sort of speaker and listener neutral, right? And generalizing it in this way. And again, this enables us to quantify, qualify, and compare requirements, introducing new textual functions on top of the interpersonal functions. So now we've got a new noun term, requirements, but notice how differently it entered language than talk of wolves. There's no presumption that there should be anything like a causal relationship or an observation or perceptual relation to some features of the world to get it in there. All right, let's talk metaphysical modal claims now, rather than, I guess it was mostly deontic I was just talking about. Many people think that these require modal properties or possible worlds to serve as truth makers. The truth maker assumption leads us into familiar problems. Placement problems, how could they be in the natural world? Epistemological problems, how could we know them? Methodological problems, why would we think that a sort of conceptual analysis that proceeds by means of considering imagined cases should have anything to tell us about other possible worlds or modal properties? The grounding problem, how could the statue and clay have different modal properties given that they have all the same intrinsic features? Okay, range of familiar problems. Suppose we suspend the truth maker assumption and stop looking at that range of candidates and just pushing for one of them over the others as the real truth makers. We can notice instead that metaphysical modal claims, like other modal claims, are serving a regulative function. But what regulation? Now, not exactly behavior. We're not getting people to clean their rooms or not kill their sister, right? Instead, I think, and this part's in norms and necessity, not all of this is, because I hadn't gotten to systemic functional linguistics yet. I think of our metaphysical modal claims as ways of mandating and sometimes renegotiating semantic requirements and permissions, rules of use for our terms, in the useful form of object language indicatives. I try to talk in the book about why that's useful. So these don't come up a whole lot in ordinary speech, right? Linguists have hardly even studied them because these are really mainly a philosopher's territory. But there's some examples that you can see would count as metaphysical necessities in ordinary speech. Imagine a child comes up to you with a diagram that looks like this. It says, look, I drew a square, right? You might correct them and inform them by saying, well, squares must have four sides that are the same length. And these are different lengths, right? And this is one of the things that gets counted as a metaphysical necessity, that a square has four sides of the same length. But what you're doing is instructing the child in the proper use of the word square. Or you might put it more formally and say squares necessarily have four equal sides. Take a case in philosophy of art, right? Imagine, as Arthur once did, Testadura, the hardhead I think it is, walking into the museum, seeing the Jackson Pollock, and saying, that's not a work of art, it doesn't even look like anything, right? And the philosopher of art in the room might turn to them and say, look, works of art don't have to be mimetic. Or put more formally, it's possible for there to be non-mimetic or even non-representational works of art. Metaphysical modal truth about works of art. But in a way that is correcting the narrow use of the term art by the first speaker. Notice we can also introduce even possible worlds talk in this way through these kinds of easy inferences. So we can get all the way up to it's possible that P, we've talked about that. And from that, we can infer that there is a possible world in which P. And notice that this was actually David Lewis's original way of introducing possible worlds talk, not his final way. But this is kind of where he started. Let's see, I'll start in the middle. Ordinary language permits the paraphrase. There are many ways things could have been besides the way they are. I believe things could have been different in countless ways. I believe permissible paraphrases of what I believe. Taking the paraphrase at its face value, I therefore believe in the existence of entities that might be called ways things could have been. I prefer to call them possible worlds. Okay, so the underlying point here, this is just a sketch, of course, is that talk about things like modal properties, modal facts, and possible worlds is derived from more basic modal claims using modal verbs, where those serve primarily interpersonal functions, I think especially regulative functions, and then you engage in a kind of hypostatization to enable you to move from saying possibly something or other to saying there is a possible world in which something or other, and that adds new textual functions to your discourse. New expressive power, as Lewis put it, right, for possible worlds talk. But again, notice that we have for these nouns like possible world, modal fact, and so on, a really different way into language from congruent nouns like wolf that are acquired observationally to track worldly features. So for these modal nouns, We shouldn't even expect there to be any requirement that in order to use the noun properly, we be able to observe the modal features of the world, as it troubled Hume that we couldn't, or track them. We shouldn't presume that we can get a kind of causal explanation of how we come to know them by having them affect our senses, the modal properties, or the possible worlds, or whatever. We shouldn't assume that they really ought to supervene on natural properties, right, in the way that we expect some chemical properties to supervene on sort of finer-grained chemical and microscopic properties, right? What we're doing here is something different in issuing our modal claim, something regulative that then we can nominalize out of. So we get a lot of pseudo problems if we take terms like possible world modal property on analogy with congruent observational nouns. Problems like, which are the real truth makers for modal statements? Are there really such things as modal properties or possible worlds? We get, endless debates in the journals. What would positing possible worlds say explain? How could they be placed in the natural order, positing modal properties? How could we come to know them if we lack causal contact with them? And we can make progress on some of these old problems then by respecting the differences in linguistic functions and rules. We can dissolve some of these problems. And also, this comes in at the end of norms and necessity. I think we can also get a better account of modal knowledge, of how we can acquire modal knowledge not by peering into some other possible world or detecting modal properties of this world, but rather through semantic competence with the rules of use for our terms, sometimes empirical knowledge, and ability to state these explicitly in object language indicatives, demystifying it. Okay, so I've argued that the explanatory and truth maker conceptions of metaphysics both rely on a kind of functional monist assumption, in a way that you might think of as sort of falsely assimilating all discourse to a single model, and that this leads them astray into misguided criteria and pseudo problems. We do better to start a step back and ask what functions the discourse serves and what rules it follows, and this can lead us to reassess the legitimacy and relevance of many metaphysical criteria and demands, and to unravel or make new progress on old problems. I've just given you one example today on modality. We talked a little bit about property talk and number talk yesterday. Then you might ask, all right, well, think of it this way, right? If metaphysics was rejected in the first half of the 20th century by positivists, ordinary language philosophers, phenomenologists, brought back by Quine and then altered by Armstrong and the truthmaker conception as a way of doing metaphysics, if we get rid of those, what else should we do? Do we give metaphysics up entirely? What are we going to do in that corner of philosophy? Are we going to reject all these debates, right? Tomorrow, I'll talk about how metaphysics can be reconceived. I don't aim to kill metaphysics, but to change our way of looking at what we can do and how we can do it in a way that demystifies it. I'll suggest that we can think of metaphysics not as in the game of making deep worldly discoveries, but rather as concerned with interesting and important linguistic and conceptual work that's of central relevance to human life. So tune in tomorrow for that. That's all for today.
So Amie, thank you for this very interesting lecture. It's time for questions. Please raise your hands. You started yesterday, but let's do it today too.
You must bring in some before you stop.
Go for it.
Because I've done a lot of ontology, and I by no means regard myself as infallible. So I may have made a lot of mistakes, but I'm fairly sure that I have the cause of my mistakes is not a belief in a monist assumption that all philosophical talk or all talk is descriptive. Already as a young undergraduate philosophy student in Gothenburg in the mid-1960s, I met what you had on one of your slides, Austin's description of Austin's the descriptive fallacy, because one of my teachers has been studying for Austin, wrote his dissertation about Austin and propagated Austin and a bit Wittgenstein speech theory, and I took it to my heart and I still believe in it. So If you can't simply, how can you say so about all? You don't know, all philosophers, that the only way to explain their mistake is this belief in functional monism. Now, you don't have belief in it. Now, when I tried, in order to criticize you, I will say, I don't think you're really true to your own description of language. I accept more or less everything you said about all the functions that language uses can have. But then you seem to leave out of account, or in some curious way drop the simple descriptive function of language we all use today. Is it raining? No, no longer. And so I know we take perception to be veridical, and the descriptive function is there, even though, as you say, it comes late in children. But without that, there would be no science whatsoever. And so, to me, you, in a very curious way, suddenly stop being true to your enterprise, that you accept all the different functions language can have. If you take this with Gilbert Ryle, I read Gilbert Ryle, The Concept of Mind, as an undergraduate philosophy student. So about this...
Could you shorten your question so, so Amie has a chance to answer? Just a brief, put it in a brief form.
Yeah. Okay. I think dispositional talk, you said, must should be interpreted like a Ryle as an inference ticket. But why not? It can be, dispositional talk can be used as an inference ticket, but it can also be used in a descriptive way. So my accusation is, it's not a question, it's an accusation.
Starts off with the bag.
Yeah.
I gotta be a peacemaker. I was not accusing you. I love your work. You are not one of the targets of this, right? So I've been kind of lost in American metaphysics land, right? And the targets, I don't mean to accuse all metaphysicians of these mistakes I've been talking about over the last 2 days, right? Metaphysics is a diverse lot, and I grew to love metaphysics being brought up on metaphysics like you do. Then I got out into the world and I found it was being done very differently by the people who were the most respected in my philosophical circles, by the Van Imwagens and Siders and Camerons and so on, right? I don't mean the critique to be nearly as broad as you're taking it. So that's why I sort of separate out into 2 days. I think there's these two common assumptions among many metaphysicians, the explanatory conception and the truth maker, that have played a big role. It's not the only way metaphysics has ever been done. It's not the only way it's done now. I think we need to call attention to it and guard against the mistakes this can lead to in order to avoid, at the very least, a lot of wasted time in papers in metaphysics and a sort of misunderstanding of what we can do. I think you take me to be much more broad and antagonistic than I mean to be, not just against metaphysics, but in the functional work. I don't mean to deny that language can have a descriptive function. I mean to deny that that's the only function that it serves. And I mean to say that assuming that's the only function it serves often leads us astray on those philosophical problems that are most problematic, right? Most sort of perennial problems about morality, modality, even things like properties and so on. I mean, there's a simple sense, of course, in which you can say that any of this talk is descriptive. It carries ideational content. You could even, if you want, talk in a very lightweight sense about truth makers and sort of restate it and say, well, the truth makers for claims about modal properties are modal properties. But what you shouldn't think of is to think of this on analogy with our sort of ordinary congruent descriptive statements, where we have to ask which parts of the world we're causally related to, that we acquired reference in regard to, that can serve as explanatory truth makers rather than just a kind of restatement. So I don't mean to be that broad. This is not an indictment of absolutely everything that's ever been done in a metaphysics journal or a metaphysics book, and I'll talk tomorrow about sort of what I think can be preserved, right? And I don't mean to deny that language has a descriptive function, only to be acting against a broad assumption that's the only function by calling attention to the others. But calling attention to the others doesn't mean that function's not there. There's questions about exactly how we should understand it, and then it's sort of light in a heavyweight sense. So hopefully that makes a bit less antagonistic anyway.
So next in line was Paul Russell, I think.
Thanks so much for your talk, both of your talks, which have been extremely interesting. And I hope I'm going to do justice to this. It's not my own area, but it does touch on a lot. It probably touches on everybody's area in philosophy in some way or other. And I'm thinking here, when you were speaking today, your kind of critique of the truth-maker view, but and overlapping with what you were saying yesterday about the explanatory view, it relates to, I don't know if you know Phil Kitcher's work on life after faith. And I just wanted partly to toss this to you. I'm possibly tracking some comments that were questions that were put to you yesterday, but Kitcher makes he doesn't like the kind of positivist aspect of the new atheism in response to understanding religion. So I was trying to sort of channeling some of what you were saying today, which sounds like I share your sense of the kind of arid, reduced scientific world of positivism that seems connected with, if I understand this properly, the explanatory and truth-maker models. So an obvious attraction of the pluralistic functionalist model you're developing is that it seems to accommodate a much richer world, a much richer conception of reality, and in that sense be liberal and open-minded. And that might include things like religion. But I wonder, in pushing that, Kitcher makes a distinction. He says, well, one model of religion that a lot of religious people have in mind is a kind of, it's a explanatory model. It describes the world. It tells us there's God, there are sacred places, there are spirits and souls, and so on and so forth. So it has these kind of ontological commitments under that understanding. But another model, he says, that he wants to save, even as an atheist, is a guidance model, which has got to do with the kind of function of helping us live, consoling us, with not just describing the world, but helping us live in it and live together in it. So I find myself, to be honest, I'm just putting my cards on the table here, I'm kind of atheistic in my orientation as well, but I have some sympathy with his distaste for a certain kind of flat, scientific, positivistic response here. But I have two questions about this that arise from this that make me feel kind of a little bit not able to go too far down the track. This is my kind of latent Humeanism. One is that there's a kind of question here about how you decide which of those functions is the legitimate function. So the worry here is that, yes, it's fine to be if I can put it slightly more sharply here, it's fine to be pluralistic and to say that's what's going on, but how do we adjudicate between legitimate and illegitimate functions? Especially if those functions seem to actually conflict with each other, where somebody thinks, I'm describing what the world is like, and someone says, no, you're not, you're just telling us how to cope in it. And they might both be sincerely religious, but not really agreeing about how things are. And if I can just tweak one final thing, if I'm not throwing too much out here, there might be a worry, and I think this might apply to the moral case as well, where some people think they're describing how the world, when they say Putin is evil, they're saying something about the world. And that actually helps them figure out how they respond to the world themselves and guides them. So as it were, the functions are entangled. And how then, if one function might seem legitimate, but might be entangled with one that's problematic. So, yeah.
What do we do? I'll try to talk about that a little tomorrow too. Yeah, it's all super interesting. Thank you. And I think there is a strong parallel there. And one might, along those lines, I mean, what you're kind of asking is a conceptual engineering question, which I'll come to a little more tomorrow, right? So suppose you take religious discourse, right? That I think it's absolutely right that it's too quick to say, look, it's supposed to fulfill this explanatory function. It fails. We do better with science. Get rid of it all, right? If we don't notice the other functions it might serve in guiding our lives and consoling us, maybe also in increasing social bonding and things like that. I know people talk about that in a way. So I think that's very much up the street that I'm talking about. And there's also interesting questions about whether religious discourse could continue to serve a guiding function if we give up the sort of metaphysics side of it, right? You say, oh, well, God doesn't exist, then is everything permitted, or can we just keep living as Episcopalians or whatever we are, right? The Episcopalians aren't super serious about the metaphysical side. So what do we do to assess which of these functions is legitimate or what we should do with it? I don't have a good recipe here, apart from if you're going to engage in conceptual engineering questions, what should we do with religious discourse, for example? Then I think the point you're making is a really important one. The first thing we have to do is to try to think carefully about all the functions that it serves and lay them on the table, rather than just a simple, well, here's a problem, get rid of it, right? I mean, the same thing kind of happens with Kevin Sharp's work on truth and many other concepts, right? He's like, well, most of our concepts are inconsistent, so at least for serious philosophical purposes, get rid of them or revise them or break them in two, as in the case of truth. And again, I think of that as somewhat narrow, right? And before we do this kind of radical reconstructive work, we ought to attend to the range of functions. Then we can at least get it on the table. And we can also look at some of the negative side, right? So maybe religion has served a social bonding function, but maybe it also has increased divisions between groups who identify with different religions in ways that have led to tension. So I think there's no substitute for at least laying all those functions on the table as a way of getting clearer about how to go about making decisions and clear about why people are talking past each other. If one says, no, religion's stupid, get id of it, it's all false, and the other says, no, look, religion's really important to society, maybe we can at least diagnose some verbal disputes, cases in which people are talking past each other, and get a better sense of the full range of functions to take into account before we consider revising or removing it from our conceptual system and way of life. So, yeah. Thanks. That's cool.
So, Arvid Bove.
Thanks again for this talk. So, I'd like to ask about a kind of demarcation problem concerning truth-making. So, I think there's a general kind of difficulty for quasi-realists, easy ontologists, deflationists, and so on to explain how exactly their views differ from those of heavy-duty metaphysicians and representationalists and so on, right? Because, for example, you don't deny that words refer, you just kind of give it a deflationist reading.
Right.
And so then the question is, how exactly does your view differ from those other heavy-duty representationalists? And in the case of truth-making, I was wondering, I mean, it seems like truth-maker maximalism, for example, can be accepted by someone like you, because you can just kind of deflate it by saying that, well, you know, if I were to strike the match, it would light, is made true by the fact that if I were to blah, blah, and then give a kind of deflationist view of facts. So then where do you differ exactly from those you've been discussing? That you call truth-maker theorists?
So I think I'll take the second question first and then go back to the first. There's sort of lightweight and heavyweight senses of truth-making. So in a kind of lightweight sense, it's okay if you want to just sort of echo a sentence and say the truth-maker for if you strike a match, it will light it, instead if you strike a match, it will light it. Maybe some of this can even be used in semantic theory, in trying to sort of give a story about compositionality of meaning, and you want to use these sort of appeals to the reference to articulate the ways in which meaning is compositional, even for our modal claims or our counterfactual claims. I got nothing against that. Right? Where I differ is from those who would think of the need to sort of posit truth makers in an explanatory way. So in the kind of sense we were just talking about, the lightweight sense, right? You've really got, again, like what I talked about yesterday, a kind of normative virtue. If it was supposed to be an explanation. It doesn't have to be put as an explanation. It can just be put as a way of speaking that's useful for semantic theory, right? So I would not think of truth makers as explanatory posits. I would not think of the appeal to truth makers as a way to get at claims about what really exists or what really is fundamental, right? So there's some harmless truth maker talk that's okay with me. On the demarcation problem, okay. So this is often put as you know, just warming up to the question here, as a problem of distinguishing representational from non-representational discourse. And if I remember correctly, Blackburn does it something like by, whether the objects come first. So, for example, the objects explain the talk, or if the talk explains the objects. Roughly, I'm probably not putting this exactly right. I want to do things I don't think that's a million miles off what I want to do, but I want to do things in an even more fine-grained way. So I think we're going to get further eventually, and I'm really only at the beginnings of this work for myself. If we speak not simply of a kind of bifurcation between representational and non-representational discourse. As you've seen already in the last couple of days, right, I think there's really different rules of use that introduce modal nouns versus property talk versus number talk, etc., right? And in some ways, I think it can be misleading to say it's all sort of non-representational because you can get a kind of harmless sense of representation. What I really want to talk about instead is the differences in rules of use, which will be many and varied, and it won't just be those two sets, there's the representational and the non-representational. So I think the discourse we traditionally think of, or even Blackburn would think of as representational, right, is that is congruent nouns introduced observationally and congruent verbs introduced observationally and so on for the purpose of tracking features of the environment. This is pretty close to what Hugh Price talks about as e-representational discourse, right? That tends to be the paradigm a lot of people work from. That's the first language we learn. It's really important. But then I think we can distinguish from those all of these different entry rules that enable us to move from there to talk about Aristotelian universals, numbers, modal properties, and so on. And it's really, I think, by tracking these differences in rules that result from the need for these terms to fulfill different, often interpersonal and textual functions, which is where they originate, that we can, I think, do our best job of really, in a fine-grained way, diagnosing why the problem of modal epistemology can be reconfigured, right? Or why we really shouldn't worry about properties being in two places at the same time, or whatever. So that's roughly the route I would go, sort of distinguishing the kind of congruent observationally acquired language from language, especially noun terms that are introduced via other routes. But these other routes are many and varied, and there may be different constraints and problems that arise depending on those routes. Does that help a bit? That's kind of how I would try to ramify the kind of Blackburn style approach. And it's not exactly a bifurcation thesis, it's a multifurcation.
So Erik Olsson is next.
Yeah, thank you very much. Hugely interesting. Very friendly and remark, I think. I wonder about your use of empirical results in philosophy and in metaphysics. So I try to do something parallel in epistemology. So I work on reliabilist epistemology, and there you have the so-called generality problem, which is about categorizing processes of belief formation in some objective way. And then I rely on work in basic level theory in linguistics and in cognitive science and all that. And but then people are very unsatisfied with that kind of thing because they think it's kind of non-philosophical somehow, or it's the problem is supposed to be deeper than just going to this and that, to rely on some science. So so I think you and I are thinking very similarly in that way. I mean, I think we are very much Aquinians in our way of applying naturalized epistemology. So my question is rather strategic. Do you have a good answer to these people who probably raise similar issues in your case about your reliance on what you call systematic functional linguistics? So do they accept your reliance on that work, or do they think that you should somehow work more within the metaphysics itself and perhaps rely on physics but not on various other parts of science? Or do you get that kind of response?
Yeah, sometimes, yeah. And I think this is pretty new work, so I'm still finding out what responses I get. The usual sort of knee-jerk response among metaphysicians, I don't know if it's the same among epistemologists, right, is to say, why are you studying linguistics? Who the hell cares about linguistics? We're metaphysicians. We care about the world. Yeah, you get that? Or we care about knowledge, not... Yeah, okay. Yeah, so, and then the kind of route I'm trying to take in response... I mean, Hugh Price has a beautiful line on this that you probably know, right? That is, part of the way he puts it is that a lot of metaphysics in the last 50 years or more has been guided by a kind of object naturalism. Those people who call themselves naturalists say, I'm only going to respect naturalistic, respectably entities, right? And Hugh says, well, look, you ought to also respect, don't worry about what the objects are, right? Respect the kind of subject naturalism that asks also and turns to the natural sciences to answer questions about our language, our practices, our concepts. And then if we find work from systemic functional linguistics that gives us reason to think that those old metaphysical problems are pseudo-problems, we ought to go with that. The other kind of route I've been taking is to just try to resist that move that says we care about the world, not about language, by just trying in as much detail as I can to show why the understanding of the language can show you that some of the problems you were addressing are really pseudo-problems. Of course they don't like that, but that's that's at any rate part of the attempt, and at least it, you know, it can claim to make use of empirical work, but you don't like linguistics, right? And empirical results in applying them to philosophical problems. So that appeals to some, but I don't. Did that address the kind of feedback you get, or did I miss a corner of it?
But we can talk more later.
Yeah, good. I'd be interested to hear more of what you've been encountering.
We have plenty of time for more questions.
I'll be short.
Shorter this time, Ingvar. Yes.
Well, the question. What is the difference between your view on philosophy and what was called in the 50s and 60s ordinary language philosophy with Gilbert Ryle as the big figure? What's the difference?
Yeah.
Between, yeah.
Not huge. And Ryle was it's a big inspiration for my work. So I really think of my work, from the beginning of my work, to Back to Fiction and Metaphysics, as really inspired by phenomenology and ordinary language philosophy, which I think of as important, pretty closely related historically and in terms of their orientation. Now what happened, of course, was in between then, and when I came into the philosophical world, right, that approach was often considered to have been discredited. Right, by Quinean doubts about analyticity. So then we can't analyze meanings, we can't do conceptual analysis, right? By Kripkean claims that say, oh, we can't just find meanings by introspection, the meanings are out there in the world, right? We've got to empirically discover the meanings of our terms. So we can't just do conceptual analysis. So part of the work for me, especially my earlier stages, through things like ordinary objects and also, to some extent, ontology made easy, lay in trying to, and some of norms of necessity too, trying to respond to those criticisms, to show why this kind of approach is still doable, is still fruitful. Can it take into account the lessons we get legitimately out of Kripke? Can defend a notion of meaning that we can reveal through a kind of conceptual work that doesn't rely on problematic notions of analyticity. So I've done a lot of that, trying to sort of show how we can bring it back in this current context, where, again, at least in the US, I'd love to hear how it's been in Sweden. I know it's been a little different in the UK. There's been more of a lingering influence of ordinary language philosophy. Why that's still viable. The other side, I think, a lot of the sort of more recent emphasis I've had on functional pluralism in language, again, it was out there, right, in the first half of the 20th century in work of Ryle, which I'm a big fan of. Doesn't mean I agree with everything he says about dispositions, by the way. That was an example. That wasn't me endorsing his view of dispositions, but saying you don't want to just throw it out without argument, at least. And Armstrong misunderstood it. But anyway, it's in Ryle, it's in Eyre, it's in Ramsey, right? There's a whole lot of Hare, right? A whole lot of sort of first half of 20th century work that's attuned to this kind of functional pluralism. But this, again, I think, is an idea that it remained in metaethics, right? Thanks to people like Blackburn, who I guess was here not that long ago. But it didn't really remain something people were aware of in metaphysics, at least, again, in my corner of metaphysics, and the people I tend to find myself arguing with at conferences and in the journals and so on, was really forgotten. So another thing I've been trying to do is to bring back that angle, right? Which again is it's closely related to things in speech act theory and bits of ordinary language philosophy like Ryle's, and show how to develop it systematically in a current context using some recent work in linguistics in ways that are going to help overcome some of the resistance to it and objections to it, and show how it can be developed in modern terms. So in a way, it is kind of a return to first half of 20th century work, and part of my sense, which I know is not widely shared among my metaphysics colleagues, is that metaphysics, at any rate, took kind of American metaphysics of certain branches, the Neo-Quinians and to some extent the truth-maker theorists, took a kind of wrong turn. And I'd rather go back to kind of phenomenological ontology type approach and a kind of ordinary language approach to ontological questions, like you're seeing people like Strawson and Ryle and so on. So does that answer your question? A bit.
I hope for a one-liner.
Oh, sorry.
What is the difference between me and ordinary language philosopher?
Perhaps I have a follow-up on this. So I think I agree with Ingvar. Do you describe metaphysicians as being functional monists?
At least those
all of them are, but it seems to me that's not the case. That most of them would accept pluralism. But if you use the language in a representational way, there will be something that, if it is true, something in the world that makes it true. And you just have to accept that sometimes you use the language in that way. And take someone like Searle, who you mentioned, the speech act theories and so on. I mean, he of course has developed speech act theory and emphasized that you can use the language in various ways. But he is also defending like a truth-maker theory. So why would you describe metaphysicians as functional monists? That seems to be simplifying the matters.
Again, I didn't mean this to be applied, and if I spoke that way, then remove it from the record, about all metaphysicians, right? It's too diverse a group to put in one heading. What I've tried to do is just to identify two sort of dominant threads in the revival of metaphysics and show why these kinds of threads in the way they've been used rely on functional monism. But there are many metaphysicians with many approaches and attitudes, and it may not apply to all of them.
And I have a second question, if I may. So you describe yourself now as an ordinary language philosopher, but you're also a neo-Carnapian.
Yeah.
And he doesn't focus on ordinary language,
right?
But on explications, for example, and developing technical language that differs from ordinary language.
Yes.
So could you comment on those two aspects of your philosophy, how they combine?
Yeah, absolutely. So in a way, I see myself as kind of doing an ordinary language version of Carnap. Right, so Carnap, again, I think in some of his writings you can see him have broader interests, but his most well-known work, including on explication, again, really, in some ways has blinders on. What he's interested in is improving language for use in the natural sciences. Philosophy is the handmaid into the natural sciences, and I think that's cool. But I don't think it's the only thing that we can do and we need to do. And just given where I've come from, I started out from interest in fictional characters and social and cultural objects, and social groups and things like that, that I'm interested in a much wider range of language. I still think some of the tools Carnap gives us, like the distinction between internal and external questions and how we can understand external questions in a practical way, is crucial. But I'm much more attuned to, it's not that I think it's the only thing that's worth doing, it's just what I have to give, I guess, attuned to trying to understand the way natural language works, how that linguistic framework works, how we can make sense of it, how we can dissolve puzzles and paradoxes, what it commits us to, and then questions about how we should change that, than I am to artificial languages for use in the sciences. And, kudos to those who do that too. That's also valuable. It's just not me. Yeah.
So we still have some minutes left.
Just a short question. Have you found anything of use in the writings of Bertrand Russell on ontology and metaphysics?
To be honest, I haven't been back to Russell in quite some time. So those of you who know Russell better, if you see some relations, I would love to hear about them. I mean, I was sort of brought up on the Russell that sort of, made fun of Meinong for thinking that there are non-existent objects, who was concerned with problems of denoting, logical atomism, things like that. I don't naturally see any connection to the way that I want to be.
What about this neutral monism?
What about neutral monism, he asks.
I'm afraid I don't remember it well enough to comment confidently. There may well be things of relevance. I mean, there's so much in his work, and
because you're using holism.
So can you repeat that in the microphone, please?
Yeah, all these words, terms, they fly around and change meaning. But, his neutral monism was a third position that sort of sounds sometimes like the way you are arguing.
How would you define Russell's neutral monism? Can you just remind me what's
Well,
involved in that?
define. Let me tell you tomorrow. I have to go.
Okay, yeah, I just want to make sure that I remember the
out,
target before I answer, because my memories of Russell are from way back in graduate school days mostly, so I just can't speak confidently to it now, but I'd be very open to hearing more about what the connections might be.
I think we have time for a final question. Ingvar?
I think there's one back
Third
there.
is the, okay, Niklas.
Maybe two. Yeah,
Niklas Dahl.
Thank you. It's a bit of a follow-up to Tobias and Ingvar's question on the accusation of metaphysicians being representationalists or having these descriptive view of language. Would you say that you hold a local or global anti-representationalism about language? Is even the descriptive functions of language non-representational?
So it's all going to depend on what you mean by representational. But I certainly, if I have to just choose yes or no, I'm global, right? I have a paper in which I respond to Blackburn's concerns about why you need a kind of bifurcation thesis and show how you can even talk about ordinary objects, for example, in these terms. Roughly what I would want, as I was saying in response to Arvid's question, is what I'd want is a range of different stories about the ways in which different terms function. In none of them do I really want a kind of picture theory, that form of representationalism, nor a kind of explanatory thing. In some cases, though, I do want a causal connection to the world, causal acquisition of terms, the world providing checks on how we use these things, a kind of e-representational or tracking function as Hugh Price would have it. So I do want a range of different rules of use, but none of them a kind of traditional explanatory picture theory, if that helps, just to locate it at least without defending it.
Follow up, yeah.
No, I think that's a very good view of it. I agree wholeheartedly. But I think that also sort of speaks to the criticism that why this would target metaphysicians, because you would probably want a stronger notion of representation, which you then would seem to say that they require for making truth-maker theory. Is that sort of the why this attacks truth-maker theory and explanatory notions of metaphysics? That they require stronger notions of representation for descriptive language than you would?
Yes, roughly. So this, if you think of it as involved, and this may not be true of every truth-maker theorist. I'm not convinced it's true of John Heil, for example. I'm pretty convinced it's true of Ross Cameron. It's not really true of Jonathan Schaffer, right? But if you have a view that says, a kind of Tractarian approach, and Sider has something like this view, right? That thinks that we can get a sort of uniquely true statement of what the truth makers are that will kind of mirror the structure of some idealized regimentation of our language. That I will reject. And my kind of response to Blackburn's worries goes along, I can't remember it off the top of my head. It's a paper called What Can Pragmatists Say About Ordinary Objects? Came out a couple of years ago. That even though, so Blackburn says, I'm trying to reconstruct this in my head. Blackburn says, look, you can't explain our talk about, say, lions. I can't remember what his example is, but some ordinary object, without appealing to the lions, right? But you can't explain our talk about morality without appealing to morality, only appealing to our needs and practices, right? And that's the difference. Well, what I want to say is the kind of metaphysical puzzles, right? In a way, you could explain our talk about lions without appealing to lions. You could go, anyone doesn't do that for, you go Trenton Merrick style and appeal to particles arranged lion-wise instead. And you don't have to refer to the lions at all to explain our talk about lions. So these distinctions that are metaphysically important here, right, are also inessential to explaining our thought and talk. What's essential is, you could say broadly, worldly stuff, right, without getting ontologically specific about whether you're talking lions or particles arranged lion-wise or it lining around here or any of those things. But that's the sense in which I think there's a parallel, and there's a sense in which we never have to sort of appeal to a unique ontology to explain our thought and talk, that we do have to have our thought and talk be responsive to the world in various ways. Yeah. Does that help a little? Yeah.
So I think time is more or less up. So let's thank Amie for this interesting talk, and big round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for the good questions and interesting discussion.